one of the most recent developments that we've done through the recommended standards in our next new NICU that was built then in 2017, and now in 30 or 40 NICUs across the country, mothers are no longer separated from their babies after their baby is delivered and has to go to the NICU. The mother gets her care right there in the same room with the baby. She knows everything that's going on, sometimes before I do. And we're not separating families anymore.
Welcome to NICU Heroes, a podcast produced exclusively for NICU professionals, with me, Kathryn Whitaker, as your host. I'm the mom of 6 children, including my very own NICU baby. This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit dedicated to providing free personalized support, resources, and community before, during, and after a baby's NICU stay. As a NICU professional, you've been well-trained to care for the tiniest and the sickest babies every day. While a NICU parent's scars are not as visible, those parents are often as fragile as their babies, requiring patience, guidance, and encouragement to ensure that they are mentally, emotionally, and physically prepared to endure the pressure of a NICU stay. NICU Heroes is dedicated to helping NICU professionals, like you, better understand, support, and nurture the entire NICU family. Howdy, everybody, and welcome back to NICU Heroes for 2025. I am super excited that we have 10 amazing guests throughout the year to talk to you about a variety of things that I know are going to help make you a better NICU professional. I love that their expertise is varied and wide, and I love that we get to dive into some really excellent conversations. My conversation today is maybe a little bit of a departure in what we typically talk about. And instead of talking about specifically medical things, although it does come up quite a bit actually, we're actually focusing on how the evolution of NICUs and their design is affecting the outcomes of neonates. So before you say, hey, Kathryn, that sounds a little nerdy and heady, I want you to know that this conversation is amazing because I'm absolutely fascinated by how the NICUs that were are not the NICUs that are and the NICUs that will be, and how that affects the outcomes of a neonate. I was actually on the internet, as one does in 2024 and 2025, and I came across this particular story, this particular video about a neonatologist that imagined that a NICU could look and feel better. And this is what I heard.
Our twin boys were born at 35 weeks and 3 days. Shortly after delivery, they were sent to the NICU to stabilize their temperature and blood sugar. A NICU can be a highly clinical and slightly scary setting, but our experience was something special.
Approximately 10 to 15% of infants in the United States require time in a neonatal intensive care unit, called the NICU. In collaboration with the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Bob White has been researching for more than 40 years what makes a NICU successful.
We knew NICUs weren't set up the best way for the care of babies, so we decided to make changes.
Dr. White has brought together leading experts in neonatology, architecture, and hospital planning to publish recommendations for improved NICU designs and standards.
There's good research showing that separating mothers and babies is not a good thing. So we were the first NICU to provide rooms where mothers and babies could receive their care together. And probably the greatest improvement, single-family rooms, which allows the families to stay 24/7 with their babies.
As a parent, it was empowering to be able to be involved in taking care of my children, all while they received medical care. Having a private room to sing with them and bond to them was life-changing. It set us up for success when we finally took the boys home.
Moving day.
Here at Boston Medical Center, we've used the design changes suggested by Notre Dame to improve our NICU. We found the design standards to be rigorously researched and provided data to support that even small changes can make a big difference for babies and families.
They've been here for over a month.
This ongoing collaboration with our team at Notre Dame and with colleagues across the world creates better outcomes for everyone.
So as I'm listening to that, fascinating, right? So as I'm listening to that, I'm thinking, I have to interview this neonatologist. And so I reached out and Dr. White said, absolutely. And so our conversation will definitely focus on what did NICUs look like? What can they look like? And what are our hopes and aspirations for what they could look like? We have a conversation about countries that are doing other things, like what's culturally normal there, and then what are we doing in the States and how that varies in the States and how that ultimately affects the outcomes of our babies in the very best of ways. This is an absolutely fascinating conversation. I know that you're going to love it. My guest today is Dr. Bob White. He's a distinguished neonatologist who served as the director of the Regional Newborn Program at Beacon Health System in South Bend, Indiana since 1981. While also holding positions as an adjunct professor at Notre Dame and chair of the committee to establish recommended standards for newborn ICU design for more than 30 years. He was recently featured in Notre Dame's What Would You Fight For series for his work with NICU babies and their families at Beacon Children's Hospital. Dr. White has dedicated his career to advancing neonatal care and medical education, and he is a gem of a human. I know that you're going to love this conversation and take so much from it. So let's get to it. Well, Dr. White, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. I know that you have a lot of expertise, and I know that our guests are going to love hearing what you have to say. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. And I love your organization. The support that Hand to Hold gives to families is wonderful and a big part of what makes their experience in the NICU, where it's so difficult to have this kind of support from people who've been there and understand their thoughts and needs. You're a great organization, so I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, I'm a little biased. I agree with you, but I get to do things for them, but I was also the recipient of being part on their peer mentorship. So it's a big part of my story too. I think it's important. So when people hear from our guests, I always like for them to hear a little bit of the backstory. So maybe share with people why you were led to medicine and specifically why neonatology.
My interest in medicine came during high school. I was in Boy Scouts, and at that point, one of the more senior kids. So I was in a sort of a junior leadership position and had worked with a younger scout who was the younger brother of a kid who had bullied me when we were both much younger. So I had this opportunity to kind of change the narrative. And then his family was on vacation one summer and were in an auto accident, and he died. And it was at that moment that I realized how much I had enjoyed working with kids. Only a little bit younger than me at the time, but I wanted to do pediatrics from that point on. I didn't know I wanted to do neonatology until my first day in residency. So I'd gone through medical school and I had expectations I'd do something in pediatrics, but neonatology really became my goal after I just happened to have the first rotation as an intern in a NICU, and I loved it. It was the best of all worlds. You took care of critically ill patients, but then even when they were better, you got to still take care of them. You had that continuity of care. You learned about the family and became a support for them. And it didn't feel like you were just providing medicine and then moving on to the next kid. It felt like you really were a support for the family. And that's kind of the feeling you get with primary care. But this was the best of intensive care and the best of primary care. And so I fell in love with it, and it was an easy decision after that to do neonatology as my fellowship and career.
Well, and what I love about it is that even after babies are discharged, most NICUs have a NICU reunion. So you get to see them grow up. I do remember some of our doctors saying, thank goodness the moms and the dads don't change too much because the babies change so much. They grow up. So I love that. So maybe let's go back to your very first days. What did a NICU look like back then? And what were some of the particularly design elements, and how were y'all caring for babies back then?
The NICUs evolved from just rooms to the side of the regular nursery, which, if you remember the photos of nurseries back then, they were these big open rooms with lots of babies, and the parents would look through the windows at their babies. So that's where the NICU started. We couldn't do much for premature babies for many years, but all of a sudden we became able to treat the most serious problems of premature babies, which are the breathing problems, both with medication, surfactant, and with ventilators. Ventilators became constructed so that they could take care of the smallest babies. And so almost overnight, we had a much larger population of babies that were being alive for weeks or months at a time before they could go home. We had to find a place for them. So initially that was one of the back rooms in a regular nursery, but as soon as somebody could build a new nursery, they were these big open rooms with 10 or 12 babies in each of these big rooms that people were very proud of. That they had incubators and ventilators lined up all down the room, and every kid was on a monitor, and it all looked pretty intensive. But to actually experience it, it was bright all the time, 24/7. It was noisy. It was crowded. There wasn't much room for families, maybe a chair at the bedside. And we didn't let them visit very much because we thought families would bring in disease from the community. And we were really reluctant to give them much access to their babies. So you can imagine these big, crowded, bustling places full of staff and the babies in these little incubators lined up.
Yeah.
That's how we started. Those rooms didn't have windows. The building codes prohibited windows because the thought was that if you put a baby incubator next to a window, they'd get too hot or too cold, depending on the season. And so they were completely lit by artificial lighting, and that was 24 hours a day because we did not have oxygen monitors, for example. So the only way we could tell if a baby was pink, had adequate oxygen, was by looking at them. So we had the lights on all the time. The babies were uncovered. We went by the incubators frequently to see if the kid's color was good. And then we drew a lot of blood gases. We stuck the baby a lot of times to actually check the oxygen level so that we could adjust their ventilators appropriately. So this was, if you can imagine the worst possible place for a sick baby to try to recuperate, that's what our original NICUs looked like.
That sounds very traumatic, not just for the babies, but for the families and the people that love them, that are trying to care for them.
And the caregivers.
Yeah, what an isolating place to be. Okay, so that's where we started. When did you start looking around saying there has to be a better way? Was that a collective movement within neonatology? Kind of give us an idea of the evolution and at what point that someone looked around and said, there's got to be a better way.
So that started early on for me. I did my training at Johns Hopkins, and that's what the NICU looked like at Johns Hopkins. And when I was then done with my training and looking for a place to start my career, I grew up here, and so did my wife, more importantly. And so I wanted to come to a place that would make the commitment to build a new NICU in a more nurturing environment. And I didn't know exactly what that looked like, but I knew a lot of things that it didn't look like.
You knew what it didn't look like. That's right.
So this was a God thing. The CEO at this hospital, I approached him and said, I will come and start the NICU program here if you promise to build me a state-of-the-art NICU within a few years, however long it takes to plan it. And God bless him, he said, okay, you're on. And that's what happened. So I didn't really know how to get from here to there, but I ran into a lot of people who did. Back then, Ross Labs, which is now Abbott, it makes formula, had a branch that did NICU designs. So we talked to them, and one of their principals is a woman named Judy Smith, who is really an expert in NICU design and has been ever since way back then. So we got started with them. Judy knew a lot of people. I ran into a lot of my colleagues who were interested in finding a better way. I followed the research, so I came in contact with a guy by the name of Mark Ray from New York, who was the expert in lighting in hospitals, who was very interested in this and willing to do research as well as help us design our new unit. And so these people gradually accumulated that had the expertise and helped us build our unit, but also gave us this idea, it's not enough just to build one. We need to change the building codes because, as I mentioned at the time, the building codes, for example, said you couldn't put windows in a NICU, and they allowed things to be very noisy and the lighting to be inappropriate. So we got this group of folks together who were willing to write new guidelines for how NICU should be designed and built. And the organization that writes these guidelines for the country, the Facilities Guidelines Institute, it's called, was receptive to having us be the organization that advised them on what those guidelines should look like for the NICU. And their standards are more than 30 states in the country default to the FGI guidelines for their building standards. So at that point, whatever we came up with, if it was accepted by FGI, then became the letter of the law for hospital construction through most of the country.
Wow. So kind of give people an idea, Dr. White, of some of the people that were on that team. I know you talked about lighting specialists in NICU design, but give people an idea of just I think people would consider, oh, if we're building something, then of course we're going to get in touch with the people that do building design or the people that do the standards. But you went a little more holistic. So give people an idea of who some of those folks were that were on the team.
Yeah, so there were nurses, there were parents, there were the specialists in acoustical design to make things as quiet as possible, architects, anybody who would be involved in a team, and we had just gone through this process in designing our new unit, anybody who would be on that team to try to make the NICU the most nurturing place possible. So all of the experts, plus all of these other folks who didn't consider themselves experts, like parents and nurses, but who had a lot of practical experience.
Right. So as you're starting to design that, Dr. White, what were you hoping would be some of the outcomes for these babies? So you have this new design, these new things that you're beginning to put into place, hopefully starting to change some of the codes. What was the hope of, okay, we're going to put these changes in, and these are some of the outcomes that we want to see?
Yeah, our hope was that it would actually allow babies to grow and develop better. And we did do some of the research, and others did as well, to show that that was the case. That, for example, if you turned the lights off at night and gave the babies a darkened environment, that they developed a better circadian rhythm, they grew more rapidly, and their development proceeded more normally by doing that. So we wanted to change from an intensive, stressful environment to as non-intensive and nurturing as we could. And we did research on a number of topics along the way to show that that is actually what happened, that babies did in fact get out of the hospital quicker, and at discharge were more likely to have better development down the road.
That must have been incredibly gratifying to know where you started and then where you were beginning to go. Certainly as a neonatologist, but also just as a human, to see some of these babies be in those environments that they were in when you first started to where they are now.
Yeah, so to have an impact on kids right here is really gratifying, but to also have been able to work with a team that improved the outcomes for kids many other places in the country and in the world. That was very gratifying and still is. We see those changes continue to advance. Private rooms, for example, were something that were anathema early on. Nurses didn't know how they could possibly take care of babies off in private rooms where they couldn't keep them under constant observation. But now private rooms are very popular, and of course families love them and take advantage of them. We have couple of care rooms now where the mother can come after she delivers and still be with her baby for many years. And still at most hospitals, when a mother delivers a baby that then has to go to the NICU, she has to stay in the regular nursery or the labor and delivery area with mothers whose babies are plenty healthy and are doing fine. And she has to travel across the hospital to go see her baby in the NICU. So one of the most recent developments that we've done through the recommended standards in our next new NICU that was built then in 2017, and now in 30 or 40 NICUs across the country, mothers are no longer separated from their babies after their baby is delivered and has to go to the NICU. The mother gets her care right there in the same room with the baby. She knows everything that's going on, sometimes before I do. And we're not separating families anymore. The inertia where we always did things the old way is gone. And now we have a new initiative where babies and families are meant to be together. And I think everybody thinks of it that way. We're trying to get the design to a point where everybody designs their units so that it will support that. So families really can be with their babies as much as they want.
You just brought up a memory. So our son was in two different NICUs. The first one was an older hospital here in Austin, very much in the Bay. It was a Bay system, so there were about 7 babies around us. And when he coded and stopped breathing, I was actually downstairs, just in the L&D unit, in the antepartum unit, actually, with all the other moms who were getting ready to have babies. And so I was surrounded by normalcy, but yet I was traveling upstairs to go to the NICU. But then when he was transported to the Children's Hospital here in Austin, it was like I stepped into the future because we had our own room with him. I was able to spend the night, many nights in the hospital with him when he was really critical. And while my care wasn't necessarily in the room, it was about 10 steps down the hall. I remember I asked the nurse, I said, because I noticed there was a little plaque on the door and it said it was donated by somebody. And I said, can you give me their address because I want to write them a thank you note, because I don't think that people realize what a huge gift it is to be so close, particularly when you don't know if your baby's going to make it through the night, to be so close to them and to have a team that was really focused on family-centered care. So I was considered as much of an expert as everybody else on the floor. It was a vastly different NICU experience, and we spent the majority of our time there. No shade to the hospital that we were at before, because certainly they were the ones that noticed that he needed more critical care. But at the same time, I got to see and live 2 very different NICUs with the same baby, which was pretty remarkable. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking it was a real gift to be at that hospital on the back end. So
That's
thank you
great. What
for
a
reminding
wonderful
me of that.
testimonial. So
Yeah, no, I
that's
love
the
that.
direction we're all going now.
So how, if there's a hospital or someone that's listening to this, Dr. Rod, and they're thinking, okay, we want to change, either make improvements in our current NICU or we're getting ready to build a NICU, how do they put in place the very best possible systems so that babies and their families can thrive?
The recommended standards for newborn ICU design are available online at the Notre Dame website. So that's a starting point, to have their architects and their team review those so that they understand what the current standards are for NICU design. There's a lot of papers written as well. The most useful thing to do, though, is to visit some NICUs that are state-of-the-art and are doing the things that they hope that they can do, because there's so much detail that you won't find in a paper, you won't find in the recommended standards, but that a nurse at the bedside or a social worker our respiratory therapist can tell you how this works in their setting, and if they could do it again, what tweaks they might do to make that space even better. So the site visits are really a crucial part of doing that, but you got to do your homework first and learn what the standards are and get an idea of the direction you want to go, and then you can build on that with all of your site visits.
It's like going home shopping. You could
Yes.
buy one on the internet. However, it's better to go take a look at the neighborhood and see what's around and see, do I like my neighbors? How do we interact with each other? So that sounds a lot like finding a good NICU. So I know you mentioned about 30 or 40, did you say 30 or 40 NICUs now sort of have this?
Yes.
So what are you seeing is the trend for as hospitals start to renovate or build new areas? Is it starting to take off? Like, are more NICUs looking around saying there is a better way? Or do you feel like you have some resistance and people are like, oh, that costs too much money or this is good enough? Like, what are you seeing as people start to make those changes?
There is resistance. People are more comfortable with what they're used to and scared about changing to a different model. There is resistance from administration because building private rooms or couple of care rooms is a lot more expensive than building big open bays. One of the things I often point to is your administrators wouldn't be telling you that if you were talking about you, adults, in big open bays. Why are they pinching pennies on babies who are at least as valuable as anybody else in the hospital? Because their full life is ahead of them if we give them a good start. So I think people do have to fight with administrators, but most of all, they have to fight with staff who are really comfortable with the old ways of doing things. And what you need there are a few influencers who are willing to travel and look at other settings and learn how things might be even better in this new system. Every hospital that converts from open bay to private rooms loses a few nurses along the way who they just don't think they can adapt to this new way of taking care of babies. But in the end, you don't go to any NICUs that have private rooms or couple of care rooms and hear people say, boy, I wish we had that open bay back again.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I think from a parent perspective, because you can't get the baby's perspective until later. Sometimes some of their things that they struggle with sort of manifest. You're like, oh, maybe the reason that they have ADHD is because this, or maybe the reason that they have, they're sensitive to light or whatever. But as a parent, I mean, I certainly can say the experience of being in a private room and having just the calmness in a very chaotic place. I remember feeling like, okay, there's a place that I can retreat. Like if we get hard news or if I just need a minute to speak to a specialist, I didn't feel like I had to do it in hushed tones because there were 6 other babies around. Because you're right, it is a very stressful place. And I think when you can sort of mitigate that and move into it and say, okay, these are some things that we can change. We can't necessarily change the critical nature, but we can change the environment in which that critical nature happens and how we respond to people, I think makes a big difference. So Dr. White, give people, so if you were to walk into your ideal NICU, give people an idea of like what they might see, what they might hear, what they might feel, so that people can sort of, since they can't do a site visit right now while we talk, I want you to sort of visually take them through what they might experience and what you would consider today an ideal NICU.
I think it starts with the impression that someone gets when they walk in the front door. They need to have lobby or welcoming area that truly is welcoming, that isn't full of signs that says you shall not do this or that. They need to have a smiling face at that front desk who can help them figure out how to get to their baby's room and what they need to do about washing their hands and this time of year wearing a mask or whatever those needs are for families as they're getting introduced. And then as they come into the care space, they need to feel like this isn't quite home, but it doesn't feel anything like what I imagined an intensive care unit would feel like. It feels like I can be here with my baby and not be anxious all the time. I can really be a parent. And relative to the last point we talked about, I do want to mention that they don't all have to be private rooms.
Sure.
Not all families can visit or spend a lot of time with their babies, and we don't need to have every baby in a private room, particularly if that turns out to be a sensory isolation space.
Mm-hmm.
There are units, ours included, that have spaces where 2 or 3 or larger numbers of babies can be in the same room together, which is probably better if the families aren't going to be there for extended periods. So the baby is not in this complete isolation.
Right.
One of the best NICU pictures that I have in my mind is when I visited a NICU in Madrid, a very old hospital built in the 80s, I think. And in this NICU, it was a big open room with 8 beds probably in the space. But all the mothers were there sitting around in a circle of rocking chairs, rocking their babies. And that place didn't need private rooms. It needed this big open space where babies got the nurturing that they needed and the families got the support that they needed. It was a beautiful setup. So I think there's room for both couple of care rooms where the mom is still a patient, for private rooms after the mom's been discharged and the family is going to spend a lot of time there with their baby, and for some open bay settings where when families aren't going to be there much of the time, those babies still have the benefit of getting some of the auditory stimulation in particular from the rest of what's going on in that space.
Well, and I love that you mentioned that because I know that a big part of being in the NICU is everyone feels isolated. But this idea that I love that you mentioned the lobby area. I think the hospital that we were at now has an area for families to congregate, almost like a family reception area, so that maybe my baby's having a procedure, or maybe they're sleeping, or maybe I just need to talk to somebody else that knows what it feels like to be there. We have a space to do that, either with our babies or without our babies, that you have a chance to connect with people, to find a way to navigate through something that's really hard and isolating that the normal average person doesn't understand. I think is such a great reminder. I love the visual of seeing all those moms and dads too. We had lots and grandparents. I know that we had some babies on our unit that there were some grandparents who came and visited them often, but that everybody's life experience is slightly different, but that chance and that opportunity to reconnect really does make a huge difference. It makes it certainly less isolating, but you feel much less alone. You're like, okay, if she can do this or he can do this, maybe we can too. So I love that you mentioned that. This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit, but we're more than simply a podcast. Hand to Hold is here to support your NICU in 2 ways. 1, you can refer your NICU parents to us for support, or 2, you can bring dedicated Hand to Hold support to your NICU, either in person or virtually. Our support consists of one-to-one group and educational resources, including our family-focused podcast, NICU Babies Parent Support. For more information, visit handtohold.org and click on NICU Professionals. So let's talk a little bit about Notre Dame's role. I know that I originally found you because Notre Dame did a story on what would you fight for? And it was talking about how you would fight for NICU babies. So what's the connection, Dr. White, between NICU Design U and Notre Dame to kind of give people an idea of what that relationship looks like?
When I came back and we started the NICU, I was interested in doing research. I had gone to Notre Dame at undergraduate, so I had some connections there. And I started asking around, are there some people, grad students or even professors, who are interested in helping us do clinical research? And there were several who were interested in that. Dr. Jim McKenna, for example, was doing a lot of research on co-sleeping, and he's in the anthropology department and research on breastfeeding. So Dr. Tom Whitman in the psychology department and some of his colleagues, we started doing a lot of the research that showed that the environment of care was important for babies and how we could improve that environment. So Notre Dame was a key research partner. And then when we started doing these recommended standards, one of those professors at Notre Dame, Dr. Kohlberg, became part of that committee and also offered to help host a website on the Notre Dame site that would be the repository for these recommended standards. So both in the research and in the recommended standards, Notre Dame provided really crucial support for getting the word out across the world that this was a better way to take care of babies.
It's like a landing place, like where can people go?
Yeah.
And that's the landing place. So do you have discussions, Dr. White, with future doctors or future folks who are interested in medicine, like giving them an idea of what you're doing now and what you hope for the future? Give us an idea of how you're sort of getting people who are interested in medicine and giving them a bigger picture of what NICUs could and can look like.
Yeah, we do have a class for students, many who are thinking about going into medical school, so they're in pre-med courses, but not exclusively for those students. And there are now several other professors who are offering similar classes that help students understand all the things about medicine that are important, but aren't chemistry and biology. So,
Yeah.
for example, one of the topics in our class is dealing with death. There's a lot of people, pre-meds, who aren't sure they want to go into medicine, or at least who don't want to go into something like NICU or adult critical care because they don't think they can emotionally handle the stresses of dealing with somebody who's dying and with the family who's going through that. So we have a physician come in and talk about how they do that and how, in many ways, it's the most gratifying part of their work that, yeah, it's hell going through that, but for that family to have somebody who really cares and is willing to listen to them and help them through that experience, that's really gratifying. We have a lot of women students at Notre Dame, and one of the things they are most interested in is how do I balance a career with being a mother and with the family? Not that guys don't worry about that, but
Sure.
but women worry about it a lot. And so we have a doctor come in and talk to them about how they balance a career and family. We talk about advocacy a lot. And Notre Dame is really big on this in lots of ways, helping people understand that you're getting an education, you're going to have a career, but you have a responsibility to give back, and you have to find ways to make the world a better place. Really, that's the theme of the whole What Would You Fight For series, that a lot of us at Notre Dame really care about not just achieving a particular career goal, but along the way, making this world a better place. And so that class gives students the tools and in fact, they have to write a paper about an advocacy, something that's near to their heart that they would like to address a legislator or a decision maker in their community. We have them research that topic and then write a 2 to 3 page paper to say how they would go about being an advocate for that issue.
I actually want to go back to something that you said. I hope that it's okay that I ask you this. You were talking about helping students deal with death and maybe particularly palliative care. When it comes to the design of the NICU, Dr. White, do you have a space for families that maybe, or I guess in the ideal design, do you have a space that might allow for a place for families to spend time with their child if their child is not going to be leaving the NICU? Kind of give us an idea of what palliative care might look like in a functioning, thriving NICU design experience.
In a NICU with private rooms, that's pretty straightforward. That room is their place, and if the baby dies, we don't move them to a different location. We had one family that this was so much their home for them and their baby. It was their first baby and we, the staff, were their surrogate family. When the baby died and they wanted to have a funeral, they had the funeral there in the patient room because that was the most comfortable place for them to say goodbye to their baby. And they invited their other family members and us, of course, to be a part of that. We do have spaces away from the room. Families want to get away, and good times or bad. So we have a balcony just outside of the NICU, so they don't have to leave the NICU. They go to, there's a parent congregating area that has a kitchen and a refrigerator and so forth. And just past that is a balcony, and they can go outside and decompress for a few minutes or longer if they need to, in a setting that they don't have to cross paths with a whole bunch of other people and try to go find a private place. So we have those kind of places right there in the NICU.
I love that we provide opportunities to sort of give people a space to either process the really hard thing, or in some places to really celebrate the good thing, because sometimes the NICU isn't always, I think people think ICU or they think critical care and they think it's depressing and sad, but I found it to be an incredibly supportive, encouraging, and uplifting place. One, because people knew how we were feeling, but also like when your kid hits a milestone, and it may feel like a small one, like when they blow out a diaper and you've been praying for it for days, you're like, finally, and like there's a lot of celebration there. So I feel like it's wonderful to know that there's places for both. It's a both and space. So speaking of wins, I know there's some things that you do as a neonatologist in your particular NICU, like when a baby leaves the NICU or you have a big celebration. So share with people some of the ways in which you honor those babies who leave, as well as remember those that don't.
While the baby's there, the really tiny ones, one of the big days is when they get to a kilo. And so we have these ribbons that we hang on the door that says Kilo Club.
I love that.
And we celebrate then that this kid is growing and thriving generally. And that's a big step for those kids. The day the kids go home, there's kind of a parade through the NICU as the families say goodbye to everybody who's around. So we know when that's happening and get our chance to say goodbyes. We have a reunion every year at the zoo locally, and 1,000 people show up. That's a real treat. And then we get Christmas cards every year from kids from years and years ago. So thousands of Christmas cards that we all get real joy from. So those are some of the moments that I remember being really special for us. I think families really are happy and proud to be able to share how their baby is doing. So a lot of them have Facebook pages and ask us to be friends on there so that we can keep up with their kids. And so kids that I've taken care of from 15 or 20 years ago, I still see how they're doing, and that's a real joy as well.
We just dropped off our Christmas card to our NICUs a few weeks ago, and it's cute because we had some friends who were there with their baby just a couple of years ago, and they were talking with the nurses, and they said, "Oh, the Whitakers, yes, we get their card every year." So it was nice to be remembered. You sometimes worry that maybe your baby sort of fall into the sea of so many faces, but there are always doctors and nurses, and even ones that didn't care for us. I think it's just a real testimony to what NICUs can do now that they could not do 20, 30 years ago. So I'm going to ask you to dream a little bit, Dr. White. I love asking this question. If you could think about what's to come in NICU design, or how we help continue to improve the outcomes of neonates and reduce the trauma. Like, what do you hope for in NICU design in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Like, what exciting things are coming, or what do you hope we can address?
The two trends that I see, one is technical and one is social. The technical one is AI. We are going to have the capability to have, for example, a kid who's on a ventilator. Back in the really bad old days, we would have to stick him for a blood gas and see what changes to make on the ventilator. And maybe once a day we'd get an x-ray and check on that, make another ventilator change. Now with AI and with the non-invasive monitoring that we have with oxygen and CO2 monitors, that's all going to happen continuously. So the baby's support is going to be adjusted constantly, not intermittently, not in increments, but in a smooth fashion. And the same is true for what we do with their IV fluids and feedings and medications. AI is going to not take us out of the loop. We're still going to be telling AI what outcomes we want, but what people are used to of going in and doing stuff to kids on a regular basis to try to decide how to change our treatment, that's going to be a lot smoother and less episodic and more continuous.
So a little bit more proactive instead of reactive, in the
Yes.
sense that, yeah, that's
Yeah.
exciting.
And that will allow us to get all the way past this critical care mindset where we're always doing something to babies.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're just telling our devices, here's the outcome that we want. Just let us know if you're having trouble keeping this kid's oxygen level between 60 and 80 or whatever the number is that we pick. And we can pay a lot more attention to brain development. We have ignored the importance of brain development, this very crucial stage of life, and kind of assumed the kids were going to be okay because we got finished with them and sent them home, and most of them seemed like they were okay, but we didn't really do them nearly as much benefit as we could. And a big part of that is encouraging families to be there and be part of their infant's care. So I think over the years, again, there will be parents who can't do this or who won't do this, but we're going to look a lot more like this nursery in Barcelona that I mentioned, or Madrid, I'm sorry, where the babies are in the arms of their parents and all of the technology is in the background and the kids just being loved and nurtured and getting the kind of support that they would normally in utero or on the outside if they were a healthy baby. The difference between a critically ill premature newborn and a good healthy baby isn't going to be nearly so obvious because a lot of that's going to be going on behind the scenes.
I love that analogy, that because I think sometimes AI gets a bad rap, Dr. Wright. Like, we think like, oh, we're outsourcing things, or we're not paying as much attention. But I love the reminder that there's certain things that AI can do, which allow doctors and nurses and specialists and respiratory therapists to look at the bigger picture, and like you said, the brain part, and maybe focus on things that there were so many. I mean, I think of babies who are pretty critically ill and maybe they have multiple issues going on. it sometimes feels like whack-a-mole. I remember with our son, it was like, okay, we fixed this, and oh, now because we did this, now this happened. And it felt like we were always sort of chasing the next thing. So to know that what's to come is that we won't necessarily always be chasing the next thing, but that some things can take care or be taken care of through AI, through parameters that are given. And then you can focus on bigger things or more important things or the things that are most critical for that particular baby. And because of AI, that could change from baby to baby. It's not the same from room to room. So I love that.
Yeah, and I think people shouldn't consider AI as some completely new, different technology. We've used computers and
Yeah.
algorithms and programs to help us monitor and change therapy already. It's so much more computerized, mechanized than it was when I first started. So AI is just the next step in this normal progression of having technology help us to do the best job of, we're still telling it what we want that job to be. It's just much better at doing it than we are episodically. It can do it continuously, and we just tweak it to tell it, now we want to keep the oxygen level a little higher, or we want to get this kid a little more calorie intake, and AI will help us do that the best way and not rely on human failings quite so
Yeah.
much.
You mentioned about Madrid. How do like American NICUs sort of compare or contrast to some of the foreign NICUs that you've been to? Like, give us an idea of. I know you mentioned the moms in the circle, sort of this communal atmosphere. Is it pretty consistent around the world as to what NICUs look like, or I'm sure it varies pretty widely depending upon the kind of
Yeah,
country
it's
that you're
really
in?
fascinating. In Scandinavia, for example, they are really into skin-to-skin care. They've been way ahead of the game on that, and they're because they have maternity leave and moms can be there all the time with
Right.
their babies. The expectation is that your baby will be held 16 or 18 hours a day, and moms are happy to do that, and dads. And so they've shown that you can do that with the smallest, most fragile babies safely, and that they benefit from that. They grow better, they get over their respiratory problems more quickly. So that's Scandinavia. But then Japan, for example, keeps their tiny kids on ventilators in incubators for months at a time, when even in the United States, as behind us, we have been on family-centered care, do much more family interaction than what happens in Japan. So it's quite variable across the world, and it's just fascinating how culture is that people come to get used to something and are just scared to change, even though the data is out there that shows that this is a better way of doing things.
I think that must be a whole other conversation of like the fascination of. I hadn't even thought about how culture influences what we consider culturally normal here in the United States may not be considered culturally normal somewhere else, and how that ultimately affects the outcomes of our babies. But what would be taboo here may not be taboo somewhere else, and vice versa. Absolutely
And
fascinating.
even in the United States, there's big differences. So
Right.
there are hospitals, I'll mention Yale New Haven as an example, where couple of care, like we're doing, they were the second hospital in the country to introduce that design and concept, where they do a lot of that. They're invested in it. They know that it works and it's safe. And you can be 50 miles down the road in another NICU where the staff just aren't comfortable with that at all. They're scared to death of getting a 22-weeker out into its mother's arms in the first few days of life because they're sure something bad will happen. And that's so we really can't generalize about culture in the United States
It's
because
true.
it's dependent on where you are,
Yeah.
and not so much geographic location, but what the local culture has been fostered. It's how the doctors feel and the nurses and the administrators. And you get a couple of people who want to change things, and maybe they can over time, but every place is going to be this individual slog to get from where we used to be to where we should be, like Scandinavia.
So I want to end with this question because I think it may help people as we're talking about advocacy and sort of the Notre Dame model of don't just walk into medicine and just be a doctor, but there's more that we're asking of you, and that's to give back. So if there is a doctor or a nurse or even an administrator that's listening to this and they're thinking like, we really want this to be at our hospital, what would be the first step for them to take to sort of transform their NICU into more of an ideal space, not only for patients, but also for their families?
Come to the Gravens Conference. The Gravens Conference is set up to provide a lot of presentations, a lot of science. They'll tell you why these things are important. And in addition, being armed then with the information, you'll meet a whole bunch of people who are already doing this, who you can call on and say, I know you fought this battle already. How did you get through it? Maybe even get some of those people to come talk to the skeptics at their hospital. So Gravens is the meeting place for people who really want to see families integrated into the care of their babies, and in general want to see babies get all the developmental support that they can, whether the families are there or not. So that's the place to start, and you'll get lots of contacts and resources from there that you can build with.
And when does that conference typically happen, Dr. Watt?
That's the first week of March in Clearwater Beach. I think it's March 6th to 9th this year, whatever that Wednesday to Friday or Saturday is.
Okay.
And it does have a website. So if people just look up Gravens Conference, Stan Graven was a neonatologist who was the grandfather of many of these ideas, and he just died recently, but the conference carries his name and always will because he was the inspiration for it. So Gravens is Gravens. If they look up Gravens Conference, they'll see what this year's agenda looks like, and hopefully some people can join us there.
No, we'll definitely make sure that we link it in the show notes. We've got a lot of good resources there. So if people are hearing this and they're like, I need to get myself to that, we'll make sure that we link it.
Great.
Dr. Watt, I just want to say thank you from a mom for looking at the NICU and feeling like, and then acting upon that feeling that there is a better way, and that we can do so many great things if we just make maybe this year we adjust the lighting, or next year we adjust the acoustics, or next year we add the lobby. Like, there are ways to implement changes over time, and certainly if you're building a new one, you can. But thank you for the commitment, for looking around at your environment and saying there has to be a better way, because while I know that probably made your day-to-day job more gratifying and more joyful, it tremendously impacted families and lives, like babies' lives, families' lives were dramatically changed because someone said there has to be a better way. So from one mom who gets to speak for many moms and dads, I just wanted to say thank you.
Thanks. That means a lot.
Well, Dr. Watt, thank you for being here. If you want to hear us next time, we'll be back next month with another great conversation. But until then, we'll see you then. Thanks, y'all, so much for listening. That was a fantastic conversation. I hope that you'll do me a favor. If you love today's episode, please share it with a friend. You can also review over on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. You can also give us a listen and a watch over on YouTube. It's how we reach more NICU professionals. Today's podcast episode is sponsored by Reckitt Mead Johnson, whose mission is to nourish the world's children for the best start in life. For more than a century, they have led the way in developing safe, high-quality, innovative nutrition products and continue to push the boundaries of nutritional knowledge with consistent, strong investments in scientific exploration.